sort of unique features of occupation, all falling under the larger umbrella of the so-called Japanese Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. So the geographical scope is one thing to consider. Another factor to consider is that the Axis powers, although nominally they're supposed to be fighting a war with a common purpose, each have their own objectives in terms of the territory that they occupy. So the manner in which the Japanese govern their occupied territories can be vastly different than what the Italians do, which can be different from what the Germans do. And really, it's impossible to generalize. One has to go on a case by case basis, even when we're looking at any one of those Axis powers. Thirdly, there is a much more pronounced ideological component to the occupations of the Second World War than in the First World War. And I don't want to suggest that there was no ideological component underpinning occupations in the First World War. There certainly was. But the ideological dimension of this component is much more pronounced during the Second World War, with far graver consequences for people living under occupation. For instance, we can find no equivalent in the First World War with respect to Germany's occupations uh, to the Holocaust in the Second World War. The Germans in the First World War did not attempt to carry out a genocide. They committed crimes, they committed atrocities, they murdered people in occupied territories, but they were not attempting to carry out a genocide that ultimately claimed the lives of 6 million European Jews and another 5 or 6 million Europeans of other ethnicities and nationalities. It just didn't happen. And that distinction is a largely ideological distinction. So there are significant differences here in terms of the role of ideology. But in common with the First World War, one of the complexities of charting out occupations in the Second World War are changing fortunes of war. So, for instance, living in occupied France in 1940, assuming you weren't Jewish, living in occupied France in 1940, assuming you weren't Jewish or a prominent communist, uh, would probably mean that life did not change all that much, especially for those living in the countryside. But by 1942 or 1944, as the fortunes of war sharply turned against Germany, that meant that living under occupation in France could be a much different prospect. For example, in terms of food requisitioning or the likelihood of young French people being conscripted for forced labor in Germany. And we saw this happen as well in the First World War. So there are some common threads, there are some parallels, but there are also some distinctions that we have to make in broad brushstrokes when we're looking at occupation in the Second World War and in the First World War. Another common thread, of course, is the fact that most of the occupation that occurs in these two conflicts is carried out by, on one hand, the Central Powers, i.e., the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, the Bulgarians as well, and in the Second World War by the Axis. Most of the wartime occupations that occur are carried out by Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Uh, there are more exceptions to that rule in the Second World War than in the First, but by and large, when we're talking about wartime occupations versus post-war occupations, it's the Axis who are the occupiers. So, in the time that remains, I want to look in the context of the Second World War at some of the ethical and moral questions of resistance. What am I talking about here? Uh, Broadly speaking, in the event of an occupation, there are essentially three courses of action that the civilian population, that the occupied population might follow. And these are not necessarily three discrete options, but they fall somewhere along a spectrum, and they can blend one up into the other. They can overlap to an extent. One of the choices, of course, is to openly collaborate with the occupiers for various reasons, to protect one's interests, to gain influence, to gain wealth, etc., etc. The second option is to do essentially nothing, to simply go about one's business as before and try to stay out of the way. And the third option is to engage in some type of resistance. Now, resistance itself also operates along a fairly wide spectrum. We can talk about sort of resistance in principle, or what we might call polemical resistance, by making it known that one did not agree with the occupation and disapproved of the policies of the occupying force. Uh, but in this case, maybe the resistor does not actually intend to physically take up arms or attempt to obstruct the occupation. One could, on the other hand, pursue sort of a passive resistance, going about one's business, but making sure not to offer any type of support or approval for the occupation. And then another possibility, of course, would be to engage in active resistance, armed resistance, to undermine the occupation in a physical way. This could be through acts of sabotage, it could be through direct attack against occupation troops or occupation authorities. It could be, for example, it could come in the form of attacks or violence perpetrated against local collaborators. This was actually a fairly typical expression of resistance in the Second World War. So there's a broad range of choices. But in any instance, in any case study, irrespective of the approach that an individual or group of individuals might take, there is clearly a moral or ethical dimension to consider here, especially when it comes to acts of militant resistance or active resistance. Because once an individual or a group chooses to engage in that sort of resistance, they're making a decision, that individual or group is making a decision that affects not only the individual or group, but potentially a very large number of bystanders who are surrounding the individual or group. So, for instance, if a group of resistors decide to assassinate a German official or a German officer or a German soldier, more than likely punishment for that assassination is going to be visited not on the perpetrator, but on innocent bystanders who knew nothing about it, but would be punished by the occupation authorities as a demonstration that such acts of resistance would not be tolerated in any form. So this is where we get into the question of the moral or ethical dilemmas that involve acts of resistance. And for anybody who's seen the film that is currently on Netflix, the Danish film, The Bombardment, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. And I don't want to spoil the plot of the film for people who haven't seen it, but basically the story revolves around the decision by the resistance in Denmark, very late in the war, to invite the Royal Air Force to drop bombs on a building in Copenhagen where the Gestapo has its headquarters and where they are questioning captured members of the Danish resistance. And the surviving elements of the Danish resistance are afraid that if this is allowed to continue, that the Germans are going to extract all kinds of information from their prisoners under torture, which will bring down the entire infrastructure of the resistance, which would destroy the resistance. So the surviving elements of the resistance, who are not in German captivity, ask for this bombing raid. And in doing so, they're making a decision that doesn't just affect the resistance, but affects everybody in the area. Because, for example, the use of bombers to strike at this Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen could result in collateral damage against civilians who happen to be in the area. And in fact, that's exactly what happens through a series of mistakes and misunderstandings. And furthermore, those who are on the outside making this decision are essentially willing to sacrifice the lives of the resistors who are already in the Gestapo headquarters because they're likely to be killed or injured in the attack. So this is a classic example in the film The Bombardment of the moral and ethical questions that are involved in engaging in resistance. This movie is a very compelling film, which I think is worth taking the time to look at if you haven't already happened to have seen it. So we're going to look at some case studies in the time that remains to see some other practical illustrations of these ethical or moral dilemmas. One important case study that we can look to when it comes to analyzing the ethics and morality of resistance to occupation was the 1942 assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. Now, we've already met Heydrich in conjunction with our discussion of genocide and the Holocaust. Heydrich was chief of the Reich Security Main Office, which was essentially the department in the SS that was responsible for carrying out the Holocaust. But like many other important Nazi officials, he was also the military governor, in effect, of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, which in simple terms was the part of Czechoslovakia that was under Nazi occupation and had not been annexed directly to the German Reich. And of course, Czechoslovakia had been under German control since 1938 and the Munich Agreement. So Heydrich, of course, was a well-known and highly enthusiastic member of the National Socialist regime and had been brought to Bohemia, Moravia, especially for that reason, to enforce stricter measures against the Czechs living under German control, and furthermore to exploit, to further exploit the industrial output that was coming from this region in support of the German war effort. So here we see again the two principal objectives of occupation. One is to keep the population under control, the other to exploit resources. Now, as this was going on, there was a Czech government in exile in Britain, as well as Czech forces in exile in Britain, who believed, the Czech government in exile believed, that compared to other Eastern and Southern European countries that were under German occupation, such as Poland, Yugoslavia, Greece, that the Czechs were not exhibiting enough acts of resistance compared to the Poles or the Yugoslavs or the Greeks, for instance. That the Czechs seemed to be too complacent living under National Socialist rule, and that if Czechoslovakia was going to have some kind of independent international voice after the war, it would have to show that it had participated directly, the Czechs had participated in resisting the Nazi occupation. And of course, to a considerable extent, any acts of resistance that were possible by the Czechs would have been largely symbolic in nature and would not have a great deal of impact strategically on the outcome of the war. And this would even include the assassination of such an important individual as Reinhard Heydrich, because there was always going to be somebody to replace him and to continue with the brutal policies of the occupation. But in any case, the Czech government in exile decided to go ahead with the project of assassinating Heydrich, and they had to know that this would have some type of cost as far as local Czech residents were concerned, because even in situations where relatively anonymous German soldiers were killed or injured by resistance actions, there was always a disproportionate series of punishments, usually meted out on the local population, who normally had nothing to do with the resistance acts in the first place. And this was likely to happen in an even more pronounced fashion in the event of the assassination of someone like Heydrich, although naturally, of course, the Czech government could not predict exactly what the consequences might be. But in the